change, disrupt, adapt, repeat. You're listening to Pure Reinvention, the podcast for curious leaders, innovators, and people who are ready for the next level and beyond.
In the Pure Reinvention process, probably one of the most fundamental and important steps is the simplify step. This is also the step that's really the most important to me and the most fun for me. Welcome to this edition of Pure Reinvention. I'm here with my co-host, Misty. How are you, Misty?
I'm good, Mike. Thanks for having me back.
So the process of simplification for many people seems very, very difficult. Yet for me, it seems like one of the most basic things in the world. Misty, why does everybody seem to find it so difficult to simplify things?
Well, it's no problem for me to answer this because I'm one of those people. Simplifying is not an easy thing for me, and I think I can speak for a lot of people when I say that it's because there's so many options, there's so much you can layer onto things and add on to make it bigger, better, stronger, faster, that you forget to cut back and simplify. You just want to keep improving on it, and most people think improvement means adding another layer of paint.
I think one of the interesting processes during reinvention is that we start to learn about the behavioral tendencies that people have and why there's such difficulty sometimes with changing behaviors to follow the pure reinvention process. So if you follow Misty's thought process, which is that it's much easier for us to layer on detail to try to make our point or to try to create some success, if we also appreciate and respect that which we call counterintuition, which is to go counter to what our natural behavioral tendency is, and to go counterintuitive, then in the simplification process, instead of adding on, we have to learn to be comfortable with taking away.
And it's that thoughtful reduction that really gives you the core, that beautiful core that tells you what your unique value proposition is and helps guide how you make the rest of your decisions.
Whether we're looking at an individual, whether we're looking at a process, whether we're looking at a company, by basically being able to understand what is at the core essence of success that individual or that process or that company has, it gives us a completely new perspective. So Misty, when I look at a individual who's truly successful, I don't really think about their most recent success. I kind of go back into the core of that person to try to understand what are those key characteristics that makes that person so successful. Do you find yourself doing the same thing?
I do. I try to look at the driving behavior or the core. It's really the best way to say it. What is everything else being built on? What's that foundation? So it is taking a simple look at the major players, the major values to move something forward.
I had an opportunity in my lifetime to build a house, and it was very interesting to me in watching that house building process that you started with a set of blueprints and a vacant piece of land, and when you tried to look at the entire process in total, it was completely overwhelming. Yet when you watched that process of building a house take place, you saw it was just one simple step at a time. And once you understood what those core simple steps were, then the building of the house was almost second nature because you just followed and completed each step. So as we think about the pure reinvention process, and of course it's perhaps fun to be the disruptor, and it's very difficult to take ownership of what is about to happen next. I use that analogy about building the house because I think for most people that what's next is the same as looking at building a house and saying, I just can't do this. How do we help those people get through that I can't do this phase?
Mm-hmm. I think you have to create a safe place for those decisions to happen and those risks to happen. We've talked about risk before, but that's the scary part because it is risky. And we have to create the place where it's okay to bring ideas to the table, it's okay to consider things, and then it's okay to question them and say, why are we doing this?
So if one thinks about the blueprint phase of looking at a house, many of us recognize and understand there's many different ways to build a house. And much like the reinvention process, there's many different outcomes that we can achieve, but we do have to start with those very, very basic elements. It may be counterintuitive for most, but what I've also begun to learn is how many people appreciate when you can begin to talk about the core key fundamentals rather than what color paint is going to be on the living room wall. That person's ability to understand what you are doing and what you are building is much clearer when you make it much more simple.
And that reminds me of something that I've heard you say a million times, and it's really been helpful in my life to hear your voice over and over in my head. Seek to first to understand. And that goes back to simplify, I think.
Stephen Covey was an individual that many people will have read his books and understand his 7 key habits. And one of those, it does resonate very deeply in this process, which is seek first to understand. And when we seek first to understand or to simplify what it is really that we're trying to accomplish, our ability to get there becomes much easier and much clearer. That when we're trying to do everything for everybody, that's an impossible task. But when we're able to have one clear understanding of what our clear and a clear focus of where we are going and why, not only does it help us along that journey, but I would venture to guess, Misty, that in looking back at the ownership stage, it actually helps us to take ownership of a changing process if we can simplify that core understanding to something that not only we can understand, and this is where I'd really like for you to kind of chime in, is it allows us to simplify our communication to others.
And that is key. When you're simply communicating, people are understanding you better. And I think that it goes back to that safe place where you feel comfortable saying, what am I really trying to say here? What message do I want to get across? And sometimes it might be, it might be a delicate situation that you have to navigate, and you have to be able to feel comfortable being honest and simplifying what you really mean to say. So I'm trying to think of a good example here, and I know I'm talking around it, not very simply, but it's when you layer something on to pad it with not kindness or pad it with everybody's ideas. And sometimes it's not everybody's ideas that are going to work, but it's hard in an organization to tell someone no or tell someone, hey, that's not going to fly. But sometimes you really need to, instead of taking on more work or expanding your mission or adding an extra day to your event, sometimes that's not really the answer, and you have to simplify.
Key leaders have the unique characteristic and actually the unique capacity to be to have a lot of capacity in their ideas. It's one of the key reasons that they're key leaders in what they do. Yet that capacity is somewhat the enemy when we go to communicate simply where it is we're going, because in the leader's mind, they've already created a lot of depth to what their house is going to look like that they're building. Yet to other people who are just beginning to understand that future direction, we have to keep those ideas very basic and very simple. Not because that people can't comprehend the complexity of where they're going, but in this phase, people first have to be able to comprehend the more basic structural changes that are about to take place. And that allows this ownership issue that we talked about last time to shift, not from the key leader at the board or the executive level, but it allows that ownership to start shifting to the rest of the employees and to the customer base and to other people who have to also be able to understand, embrace, and purchase whatever it is that this new thing that you're about to be producing. And by having the ability to with clarity, have a very simple strategy for what you're selling or producing or communicating, people can then attach to that. And it's that attachment that begins to make it real for people.
Mm-hmm. And don't get me wrong, the buy-in is important, the key stakeholders' ideas, at least having them heard and considered. And that does go back to the safe place, because you, as a good leader, you want to provide a place where there's really no judgment on the beginnings of the ideas. Now, that means good just as much as it means bad, the judgment, positive and negative. So if you say, oh, that's a good idea, you've already set that up to be the way to go, especially as a leader, because your opinion is so important to a lot of stakeholders. But then if you say it's bad, it's so quickly written off that it doesn't have time to grow and maybe evolve into something else.
I think you make a really important point here, and one that I just really didn't even think about until you mentioned it, and that is, there's a couple of different ways in which people start to watch and begin to create clarity in this new direction. One are the words that we use. We need to have our simple statements and our simple understandings for people to understand from our words where we're going. But this is also behavioral. This is also where our behaviors have to be very clear, our behaviors have to be very concise, Our behaviors have to be very consistent so that as people watch our behaviors as much as they watch our words, we're able to communicate both behaviorally and with our communications with our words exactly the kind of new house that we're building that people begin to get excited and enthused about moving into.
Well, and wouldn't you say that's exactly how you build reinvention into your culture? It's through behavior, it's through acting it and continually making it part of the way you run a business or the way you approach your staff.
I think one of the challenges that leaders have is leaders have a tendency to want to get ahead of the message. And because of the complexity of their thought, they get ahead because that's where their minds are. That's where they're playing chess 3 steps ahead. But the reality is, for the marketplace or for your employees, you have to kind of stay in the relevant here and now, because that's what people are watching and attaching to. And so behaviorally and with your communication strategy, you have to keep in mind that where you are forecasting as an executive may be very different than how your behaviors and your words will be impactful for the today and the short-term future that really people have the capacity to watch.
That's true. And what would you recommend to the executive who is trying to balance that? Because that seems like a really hard thing to juggle.
Well, I think it's a very purposeful understanding that the executive has to, while they're plotting out and forecasting where they're going and some of the next steps in any successful development of a successful company, the executive also has to keep in mind that the board or the employees or the marketplace is not in that same place in their head. And so they have to be able to separate out the planning and the forecasting that's going on in their head from the communicating and the reality that's going on. It's very purposeful. It's very intentional. I mean, a word that we like to use a lot is this word of intentional. We have to be very purposeful and very intentional that what we're planning is very different than what we're doing today, and that people, by simply talking about what we're doing today, people can begin to understand that which is right in front of them. It is the executive's responsibility to plan further out, but those are ideas that can be developed and brought to the marketplace and brought to the employees at the correct time. After all, as we've heard many times, timing is everything.
Yeah, you don't want to show all of your cards at once. You need to decide when to lay them down as it affects the game.
Misty, thanks so much for this time to talk about simplification. If you're ready to change, make it change that lasts. Make it pure reinvention. Make sure you follow us on Twitter, Facebook. And remember, we're always at www.purereinvention.com. Thanks, Misty.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pure Reinvention. Keep the conversation going and get alerts when new episodes are available by following us on Twitter at Pure Reinvention or sign up for our mailing list at purereinvention.com.